Today I want to talk about the shops that we had in our village. This was a time long before supermarkets were invented. Well, they were invented in America, but they had not come to the continent, and certainly not to the village in which I grew up. That didn't mean that there were no shops, but they were only special shops. The shop that we went to most often, and that was a shop that sold what they called mixed goods. And mixed goods was an attempt to sell everything. Always a grand claim to sell everything. But they tried to have everything that people needed, which is, of course, another matter. So this shop was called Mura, and it was on the road leading out of the village towards the nearest town called Judenburg. And it was run by Mr. and Mrs. Mura, who were friends of my parents too. Anyway, this shop sold food, but it also sold what the farmers would need. These special blue cotton serge aprons that men would wear for work. Also rubber boots, which were still rare, but you could get them. And you could get scythe to cut the grass, and you could get the replacement blades for it, and sickles. These are very old-fashioned, almost medieval farm implements, but people still used them. So you could get it there, and you could get there also the whetstone that you needed to sharpen those blades. You could get a bit of diesel for the few tractors that there were, and oil for the machinery, and all sorts of other things that I don't remember because obviously I was never sent to get any of this stuff. But we could see that they had them and they were hanging up at the side of the shop. The shop was fairly dark. It had a wooden floor that was stained with a dark, oily material, and all the counters were of wood too. So it was fairly dark in there. It had only one window and a bit of a lamp, so it was not exactly a light flooded interior, but it was interesting because of all the different stuff that they had. If you've seen a Western film, sometimes in Western films you see shops like that. Anyway, that's what our shop was like, the Mura's shop. Now, all the goods, for instance, flour, sugar, semolina, dry beans, dry goods like that, were sold not pre-packed as it is now, a kilo of this, half a kilo of that, but in great big paper sacks, usually 25 kilo. And if you wanted a kilo of flour, they took a scoop and opened the bag and took out a scoop or two and put it in the scales. Now the scale was also a wonderful implement. It was not an electric scale. It was a scale with iron weights. So you had two platforms on either side of the scales that hung from a pivot in the middle. And on the one side, you placed the desired weight. So you took two of these iron weights or whatever, half kilo each, for instance, and put them on one side, and then on the other you put your scooped up flour. And then you waited until the needle in the middle was rested in the middle. And that was fine. You had the correct weight. And then the shopkeeper would put that flour in a piece of paper, and very skillfully he made a packet out of it, sometimes just newspaper. But he was very good at making these packets that would not leak. And then you wanted, say, half a kilo of dried peas, and then you got to the pea container and so on. So he had mainly dry goods for that, dry goods and farmer goods and so on, and a few tins which were still relatively new. Tins of sardines, for instance, you could get, but they were quite expensive and were a rare treat to have a tin of sardines. Otherwise, tins of soup or so were practically unknown. Everybody made their own soup. You didn't need to buy expensively a little bit of soup, which only fed one person and cost more than 4 times to make it. So nobody wanted that then. Of course, what we always liked when we went shopping, when we were sent to buy things, not the heavy things, but the ones that we could carry, were also the sweets. And they didn't have manufactured sweets, or very few at the time, especially not in that shop. But they had something called bear's poo, and bear's poo sounded great. Actually, it was boiled sugar, simple boiled sugar, that was then broken up into pieces, and they would chip off from these hard lumps of boiled brown sugar a little piece. And so say for 2p, you got a little piece that you could suck on maybe for half an hour. So that was great. And there was something else that was of a white consistency. I have no idea what it was made of, but we quite liked that too. I think it was also a sugar-based thing, but maybe a bit of milk in it. It was a bit softer, not as hard as that shard of the bear's poo. And these were the options of the sweet. Now, of course, they also sold honey, big jars of honey that the farmers had brought and that the shopkeepers sold on. And I tell you, children, this was the most delicious honey. It was the honey mainly gathered from the little insects that are on the fir trees. Remember, our village was surrounded by miles and miles of forest, of fir and spruce forest. And on each of these trees were these special little insects which sucked the juice out of the needles of the fir trees. And then they converted that. They fed from that, but they left behind, as it were, they pulled it out, a little drop of sweetness. And that sweetness was a mixture of the tree sap that had got into the needles and the digestive juices of the little insects. And the bees loved that. And they would come and lick that up, and it was already sweet, and then it went through the digestive system of the bees. It was something we called forest honey. And that tasted strongly of the forest. Sometimes you would chew or squeeze a bit of fir twig, and it had that lovely, savory, fresh tree smell. I love that. So this thick brown forest honey, they sold too in great big jars, and then they could decant it in smaller jars. What else did they have there? Oh yes, no, they didn't have books or newspapers or anything like that. They had bread. They had some bread, great big loaves of bread, but generally the bread came from the baker. So this was that shop at the beginning. And then at the end of our time there, at the end of the 1950s, there was a great revolution because Mr. and Mrs. Murrah decided to become modern and go with the time and change their, like in a Western pioneer village shop, into a modern shop. So they had the old cupboard ripped out and they had the old floor replaced and they put two plate glass windows into the walls and so that more light could come in, and they installed shelving and a counter, and people could help themselves a little bit of some of the stuff that were there. Generally you still had to ask them, but it looked newer, and the shelves were only showing what you then had to ask the shopkeeper to get you. But it was a beginning, and everyone thought this was a great new invention that you could wander around and you could actually see what you wanted, because sometimes you didn't really know what you wanted. So this was the Murrah shop. They had three children, three boys. Or was it only two boys? I remember only two boys, but there may have been a little one too. But the older ones were exactly our age, and we often played with them. And they still live there now, and the shop still exists. And obviously now it's a shop like anywhere else. But it was an old first village shop, and the first one to convert to a supermarket. Now the other shop, the one that was on the main square, where our house was too, the house in which we lived, was a dairy sort of shop. It had a funny name of Uitz. And there we got the milk. They had milk and they had butter and they had cream. And it smelled delicious. It smelled of warm milk and cream and butter. Very special, clean smell. I loved it. And the whole shop had to be clean. So it had to be conveying the idea of cleanliness too. So it was tiled in white tiles, and it had an easy to clean floor. I don't remember quite what it was, but it was certainly not a dark wooden floor. And the counters were of marble, as far as I remember, and they had glass fronted cabinets. And on the wall, they had a stuffed fish because the grandfather of the person who owned the shop was a passionate fisherman, and he had caught an enormous ground dwelling river fish, and that fish was on the wall behind glass to be admired by everyone. It was a good 1.5 meters, if not 2 meters long, a legendary fish. Anyway, when we needed milk, we took a metal can. And the metal can, well, there were different sizes. We usually got the liter one. And it was a round can, and it had a metal lid. It was enamel. You see, enamel means that it had a metal core which was enameled so that it wouldn't rust. Usually blue outside and white inside. And it had a tightly fitting lid, and on the neck of the bottle were two holes into which you could insert a hinge, and it had a handle with a little wooden um, thing, so it was easier to carry rather than just the metal wires. So we took one or two of these cans and we went to the Uitz milk shop, and there we presented our bottles, and just to make sure, Mrs. Uitz rinsed them in warm water just to make sure it was really clean. And then she had a pulling system, a bit like in a pub when they pull a pint of beer. So it's a lever that draws out the milk from a container stored underneath the counter, and through a tap-like opening, the milk came out. And again, like with beer, she had to pump it a little bit until it was full. And she put the lid back on, wiped it a bit, and gave it back to us. So that was the milk. And this was also a shop where they had one of the first manufactured sweeties. And these sweeties we would only get sometimes because we weren't really allowed any sweets, but once in a while we got a little bit of money. Very little money, like say, like 2p or it's such little bits of money don't even exist anymore. And for that you could get a roll, a bit like a Smarties roll, or a polo roll, packed in paper like that. And it had 10 boiled sweets in it, orange and lemon. And they were covered with pictures of Max and Moritz. Max and Moritz, I tell you another time, are wonderful stories of two naughty boys that were very popular. And of course, we knew all their stories by heart, so we loved these Max and Moritz sweeties even more. And the other type of sweet they had was called a Stollwerk. And the Stollwerk was a soft toffee. And the advantage of that was that you could get it individually. You just get one little square soft toffee. And if you really had practically no money, sometimes they gave you if you were nice, or if they were in a good mood, they would, or if you didn't have enough change over there, they would give you one of them as a present. That was great. So these were the main sweets I remember that the shop also sold. And there was also some bakeries. So there were certain buns and stuff that you could only get there on a separate counter. But mainly we got our milk from there. And oh yes, they did have they had the bakeries section also sold bread, that wonderful dark rye bread. Now in those days, especially on the farms, they made their own bread. The women would get together, and every month, or sometimes every 3 weeks only, they would bake bread. And that bread was made from grain that they had grown themselves on their fields. Rye mixed with wheat, which is hard to work. The rye is hard to work, and they would knead them in great hollowed out, well, a hollowed out tree trunk, really, from a big tree. And in the hollow of that, uh, they kneaded the dough. So you had the dough, you mixed it with yeast that you had laid, rice mixed with a bit of sugar and a bit of milk, and then you kneaded the dough. And it was usually two women who did it together, taking turns, because it took a long time, sometimes an hour, until you had enough. You had released the gluten enough. And this bread would then be covered and put in a warm place, and then it would rise very, very slowly. Again, this could be a day or two. And only then was it baked in their own special bread ovens that every farm had. It needed a very strong temperature at first to seal the surface and make this lovely hard crust. And bread like that would last for weeks. They were put in linen bags and they would last for weeks. Now, of course, my mother did not make that bread, and we would have had to buy the flour and all that. And she was busy helping my father in his surgery. So we bought the bread, and there were some other people in the village who needed to buy their bread too, who weren't farmers. So the baker attached to the milk shop also baked bread. It was the same bread, delicious brown bread. And they also sold the butter to go with it. And the butter too was not pre-packaged. The butter was a great lump of butter, and he with a, I think it was some sort of wire, they cut it off pieces of butter that he then patted and put on a bit of greaseproof paper, and that was it. And I tell you, children, a slice of that bread with thick layer of that delicious butter, with the milk from the cows that we could see grazing on the fields around us, and a bit of that honey from the bees that were foraging in the forest, and also, of course, on the meadows and on the fruit trees around us, was the most delicious taste. And we usually had that for tea, I mean for afternoon tea, because my parents always had real English tea, which my aunt from London sent. We also got a little bit of tea, just with lots of milk in it. So this was the second shop. Now there was another shop on the main road that ran through the village. It was a small shop. And that small shop had interesting things. We didn't need to go there very often. But they had stationery. They had glue. They had school books, exercise books that you needed to do your homework in. I think they sold newspapers, but I'm not quite sure. There was a local newspaper. There were two local newspapers, so they did quite well. I don't think they sold books. But in that small shop they had quite nice things. They also had what we really liked and which we only were allowed to have after we'd been ill, after we'd had a fever. Our mother always made us stay in bed 3 days after the fever had gone. This was a wise precaution, because if you get up after fever too early, you weaken your organism, and in some cases you can weaken your heart. So this was something that everybody believed, and I think it's still true, that it's good to rest. Some of these childhood diseases were quite fierce. So anyway, in these 3 days, when we were still in bed but feeling all right, it was difficult for our mother to keep us in bed. So she went to this shop and she bought us these cutouts. These were stiff paper, and on this stiff paper, about A4 or even bigger, they had prints on it, and prints of a boy or a girl in their underpants, and then prints of different clothes and outfits: shoes, hats, vests, a skirt, or a pair of shorts for the boys, all that sort of thing. And you had to cut them out very carefully, and there were little tags at the side of it, and by means of these tags you could fasten these cut out garments to the figure of the boy and the girl. And that you could be happy spending quite a bit of time for, because you had to be very careful, because if you cut the little tag off, it wouldn't fit properly, and so on. It could be a nuisance. Anyway, so that's what they had there too. And I think they also sold comics. You know, there were already comics at the time, and the Austrian comics were uh, German, not American comics. The American ones came later. After all, they had to be translated. That's all. But the German comics were mainly based on German mythology. There was, for instance, one loosely based on the god of thunder, Thor. Thor has become quite popular in recent years again. They made some Hollywood films about Thor. It's interesting. And they were little black and white comics. They were uh, narrow bands read in the horizontal with about 3 drawings on each, and again they were very cheap. And they were very popular at school. So I think you could get them there too. We never had any money for those, but the older boys at school liked to get them, and some of the older boys who were a bit dumb and who never learned to read, they would ask me to read it for them. And sometimes they even gave me a Stolberg or a tiny bit of money for it. So that was good. And I got to read it, and everyone was happy. But the best thing that this shop had was the carnival stuff that they only sold around carnival. You could get there these papier mache um, paper type pressed face masks that covered your whole face and were fastened to the head by means of a rubber band that in turn was fastened to 2 holes behind each ear. And it covered the whole face from under the chin to above the hairline. And they had all sorts of different faces there. Witch faces, they were very popular. Ugly witch faces, and devil faces, and faces with huge noses, but also Negro faces, and Chinaman faces, and Red Indian faces, you know, stuff like that. The people of the earth, as it were, you could also become by putting on these masks. Because in Carnival, I'll tell you about Carnival another time, the poor children could not afford costumes, So all they did was get one of these cheap masks, and that was fine. Nobody knew who they were, did the job, and they could run around and terrorize people with their ugly witch face and so on. So they had that, and what you also needed for Carnival were, um, how to describe, they were very thin paper strips, colored in pretty colors, pink and purple and orange and so on. And they were rolled up for about a meter or so. And you then threw them into the air, and it would form a spiral, a long paper spiral. And that sort of, we called them paper snakes, Papierschlangen. They were a bit like snakes, but they were more like a slinky, a sort of spiral. And in Carnival, you'd always have 1 or 2 in your pocket, and you'd throw them. You could throw them around the person, or you could just throw them in the air, and you could hang them up in your room. And in shops and so on, people showed a bit of the atmosphere of the time by hanging some of these paper snakes from the ceiling. So that little shop had that too. I don't remember the name of it, but I can still see it and also smell it, the sort of papery smell, and especially the papery, gluey smell of the masks. And then there was one more shop I remember, and that shop was near our school. so it was towards the south. Um, and that shop was called Schilhan. And in the Schilhan shop, they sold more fresh produce, as far as I remember. They sold a few bits of fruit that they could get hold of, because the fruit distribution was not organized like it is now. The fruit was not grown in glass houses in Holland or plastic greenhouses in Spain. It was surplus that some of the farmers sold to the shopkeeper, so he could sell it to those people who didn't have gardens, which were very few. We were one of those people without gardens. So you could go to this Schilhan and see what they had in terms of fresh vegetables, with a cabbage, with a carrot, potatoes. There's not much choice. The apples that were in season, the pears that were in season. So they had that. And I think they also had um, some school books, and they sold postcards of our village and its beautiful church and so on. Not that this was a place that tourists came to, but still, every village had to have photos of its beautiful surroundings. So in case somebody came, a visitor from outside or a relative, they could buy a postcard. Once I had an adventure there in this shop. Well, it's not exactly an adventure, but I still remember it. It obviously must have been in the summer. And there was a big basket full of the most delicious plums. Dewy, dark purple, with a slight grey sheen on them, plums. And they smelled delicious, and I knew they were going to be really sweet and lovely. And I was really, really taken by these plums. I really, really wanted one. So I stole one. I stole one and put it in my pocket. And at that moment, as I put it in my pocket, I felt that I was being lifted up by the scruff of my neck. It's actually my shirt or whatever it was. And lifted in the air like a kitten. You know, like you pick up a kitten by the scruff of the neck. And I was held in the air, and I was turned around. And dear me, it was the director of our school, the fearsome Herr Ofner. Oh dear. And he shook me and said, Gwendi, I've seen what you've done. You've stolen that plum. That is stealing that you've done. And stealing is forbidden in the Bible. It's one of the 7 sins. Says you must not steal. Didn't you learn that? Oh yes, I know, you mustn't do that. No, I'm very sorry, and so on. And so he said, well, put the plum back, and remember never to steal anything. I will not punish you now, because you are punished already by being found out. So I did never forget that. And I don't remember if the shopkeeper then let me have the plum or not, but I have a feeling I didn't get the plum. It was just that strong desire to have it and to eat it and to feel the wonderful sweetness of that plum in my mouth, that terrible temptation, the succumbing to the giving in to that temptation, and then being promptly found out. That was quite extraordinary. I was quite impressed how, as it were, the authorities had their eye on me. It was just pure chance, but I was impressed by that. And I didn't steal anything, certainly not from that shop, and certainly not in that village. Again, I was too aware that even if you don't see them, people are there and catch you. So that was the Schilhan shop. And these were the 4 shops that we went to. And that provided us with most of our daily needs. Of course, that wasn't enough for my father, who was a town person. And so we also went to, remember, there was no butcher in the village, because again, most people had their own animals and would butcher them and had their own meat. And they weren't used to eating much meat. They would eat the smoked meat in the morning with a bit of polenta and a bit of smoked sausage in the afternoon. But this meat eating wasn't so common at the time as it later became, when people were richer. But anyway, the nearest town was not far away, about 20 minutes by car. And that was a town, an old medieval town, Judenburg. It was just beyond the river Mur, that big river that came from the mountains, and it flowed through the whole of the province of Styria and eventually into the Drava in Slovenia and eventually into the Danube and eventually mingled with the Danube into the Black Sea. Anyway, this river Mur was an important navigable river, and the town of Judenburg was just on the other side. It was on a bluff of rock and therefore well easy to defend. And as I said, it was a medieval town, beautiful old town. Anyway, I didn't know at the time whether it was beautiful or not. This is just normal for us. This is Judenburg now. But I was more interested in the shops there. And we especially went to 2 shops. One was the butcher, where my father selected the meat, because my father wanted meat every day. He was used to that. And my mother had to cook him a schnitzel or something meaty every day. I mean, occasionally he didn't mind a meatloaf or something, but generally he wanted that, and he also insisted on his meat soup, his beef broth, which you have every day. And my mother cooked that very well, and for that you needed a nice juicy bit of shoulder meat and some bones, some beef bones, and then it had to be cooked with a few vegetables and for a long time, simmered for hours and hours. So he bought the meat for the week there, or maybe for a few days, because we only got a fridge much later. The fridges, that's another interesting thing that you wouldn't have seen. The fridges at the time were wooden boxes, and the wooden boxes were lined with lead panels, and they had the lead panels were fastened onto the interior wood in such a way that there was a gap between the wood and the lead, and into that gap you could insert plates of ice. So real plates of ice that you could buy. Don't remember where they bought that ice, but there were shops that made ice. And this was the principle of all cooling systems. That's what the shops had. They just had much bigger ones, great big wooden cupboards lined with metal, and in between the blocks of ice. And that cooled perfectly well. So we may have had one of them, but I don't remember. I don't remember the later fridge either. I wasn't that aware of fridges. But that's what most fridges were like, wooden boxes with the metal lining. And the other shop That was even more exciting. The other shop was called a delicatessen. And in the delicatessen, you could get things, well, the sort of things you found in town, imported stuff. That used to be known as colonial wares. In Britain, which had loads of colonies, the colonial wares were even more varied because they had colonies in Africa and in India and in the Caribbean and all over the world. And different produce was imported. Coconut, for instance, bananas, chocolate, coffee. These were all colonial wares that were not grown in England, but came over the sea as the fruit of their colonies. Now, Austria didn't have colonies. I mean, they tried, but historically it didn't work out. So they had to import it from countries who had colonies. Now, for us, this was, um, well, this was England, I suppose, to some extent, but of course there was a duty on it. So we relied more on the sort of goods that were near us. So, for instance, Italy or the former Yugoslavia, which is now Croatia and Slovenia and Serbia, on the Balkan. And they used to belong to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had disappeared after the First World War. But there was still a connection there. And so the Mediterranean produce and the things from the south that would not grow in Austria, we got from Italy. So, for instance, pasta. Pasta made in Italy was, was not. I mean, you couldn't. It was not made in Austria. We made our own noodles, but it was different. I have to stop there because a phone call has come.